So we are going to be in 1 Kings today. 1 Kings, and so go ahead and find it, 1 Kings chapter 19. I was going to have somebody turn on their camera and read for us when you found it, but I forgot until just this moment. So next week we will have a volunteer get to read for us. So as you're finding 1 Kings 19, I just wanted to say that it's pretty easy for us to take things for granted, to get used to them, and to underappreciate some of the things around us. For example, for 364 days out of the year, I underappreciate the fact that my tongue is not burnt. And then, on one particular day during the Christmas time, I won't know when, but it'll happen, I will burn my tongue on hot apple cider. And then, for that entire day, I think to myself, what a miserable day. How could I have underappreciated, taken for granted the fact that for the last 364 days, my tongue has not been burnt, and I could taste things and I'm not in pain? We take things for granted. Just this week, I noticed how in our family, nobody's sick. You know, for the last several months, all winter it seemed like, there was always somebody with a fever or maybe throwing up, in bed, not doing well, a runny nose, just being miserable. And I forgot how nice it was to not have somebody to be sick. And I just realized that this week, and it's wonderful. And I'm making sure to appreciate the moment because I'm sure the next round is going to be coming soon. You know, right now, many of us are realizing how much we have taken for granted all the little things that we used to be able to do back in February. The kids could go to school. We could go into the store as a family. I don't like going into the store by myself with 50 other men. It's just us men in there. I took for granted the fact that I could take my family in, that we could all go in together. We took for granted the shelves had all the groceries and supplies that we needed. We took for granted how we could shop for shoes when the kids outgrew them. We took for granted that hugs and handshakes used to be okay. The news at night, when you watch it at 10 o'clock, used to have a variety of topics. We take that for granted. The UPS man would hand you your delivery. We could attend church without the threat of litigation. It's funny how we took those things for granted. And now, on the confines of our own property, we realize just how many freedoms and rights have been stripped away from us. Some we gave up, some were taken. And the point is, we took them for granted. And I don't know, and I didn't know, I was taking for granted the ability to buy canned foods for my family. I didn't know that I was taking for granted just the simple fact of getting an ice cream cone when we wanted to do something fun. This is why I feel like we need to look at the life of Elisha for the next little while here. God did a lot of strange and wonderful miracles through Elisha. And when we look at how God works so powerfully in an ordinary guy, I think we can recapture the awe and majesty that our God is worthy of. When we realize just how ordinary and humble his beginnings were, we can realize how amazing our God is. And I would hate to think that we have become too familiar with God. I would hate to think that we would cease to be amazed by his glory and his love for us. And so we look at Elisha today to see maybe just a taste of who he is and his goodness poured out upon us. So again, looking at Elisha, his origin story, and I think that we can start to see some encouragement from his humble beginnings. If you are just now tuning in, I want to just say quickly, I have at least, I don't know if you can see everybody, at least 25 people at least 25 people here logged in, maybe more, close to 30. And that's 30 different cameras, computers turned on. And so if each one of you has at least 2, then that's pretty exciting that we would have that many people here joining with us today. So be encouraged that you're here with other people. So looking at Elisha and his origin story, again, we can find a lot of encouragement here in his beginnings. We start with Elisha's mentor, Elijah, to see how it all came into play. And we're going to read in 1 Kings chapter 19. We're going to start in verse 15 through 17. We don't have many verses to put up there today, so we don't have a PowerPoint, but we'll be looking for that hopefully next week as we can add in different flavors of different things going on. So, 1 Kings, starting in verse 19, or chapter 19, verse 15. The Lord said to him, to Elijah, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also, anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel-Meholah to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu." That's good. A lot of swords involved here. So a lot of exciting things going on. But Elijah had this important mission from God. After meeting with God on the mountain, he was supposed to go and anoint those three people. Jehu over king of Israel, Hazael over Aram, and then Elisha to be his successor. And here's something to note. If you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, which it sounds boring, but it's amazing. It's amazing the stories that take place in there. If you read through those, Elijah only anoints Elisha. He doesn't go find Jehu, and he doesn't go find Hazael. Out of these three guys, Elijah made sure to get Elisha. He made sure to find him and to train him, to teach him in the way of the Lord, to show him by his example and his life what he's supposed to do. And after Elijah was gone, that's when Elisha then finishes God's mission and anoints both of these men kings over their respective kingdoms. So as we look at the calling of Elisha, here in the next few verses, starting in verse 19, so we're going to be in 19:19, we're going to see how serious Elisha took his calling. And he understood what it meant to be a follower of God and how important that calling was on his life. So let's read this together, and then we'll see just how these little moments each serve as an example for us as well. So 1 Kings 19 through 21. Yes, through 21. It says, "So Elijah went from there and found Elisha son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. 'Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye,' he said, 'and then I will come with you.' 'Go back,' Elijah replied. 'What have I done to you?' So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his attendant." And that's where we get to start today and see what that means. As you're thinking of that, the first point that I want to point out is that Elisha understood that he was being called. He understood this was a special calling from God. And you know, it only takes one calling to really change everything. One call can change everything. You've probably heard about the Yom Kippur War of 1973. On Israel's holiest day, when the nation was basically shut down to observe this holy day, the enemies of Israel started to gather on the Golan Heights. The armies of Egypt and Syria were preparing to destroy Israel. And because it was such a holy day, they observed it by not using anything electrical, no fires, nothing. They wanted to keep the day as sacred as possible, which left them pretty vulnerable to their enemies. And their military leaders saw the enemies gathering, but they misinterpreted their movements until it was too late. They were coming to destroy Israel. And by the second day of fighting, Israel really was brought to its knees. They were dangerously low on ammunition and fuel and the means to fight back. They had nothing left. There was nowhere to turn. And it was then that the Prime Minister, Golda Meir, placed a phone call to President Nixon at 3 o'clock in the morning, pleading for help. And Israel and the U.S. at this time weren't on the best of terms. In fact, the administration had a very anti-Semitic viewpoint at that time. But as Nixon sat there listening to the Prime Minister plead for rescue, he wasn't really hearing her as much as he was hearing his own mother's voice from years and years and years ago when he was a little boy. When he was little, his mother told him that one day he would be in a powerful position and a situation would arise where Israel and the Jews needed his help. And when it did rise, he was to help them. So Nixon authorized the proper channels to deliver help to the Israelis, and without his quick response, they would have been destroyed. The Prime Minister who had made the call had already ordered suicide pills for herself. If the enemy overruns us, then I'm going to be done with this. We don't stand a chance before them. But President Nixon came through and saved Israel, and he isn't remembered today for how he saved Israel. Now is he? One call changed everything. Historians agree the nation would have been destroyed, completely wiped out, if it had not been for the U.S.'s intervention in that particular time at that moment. One call changed everything. You see, Elisha's life was changed in a moment. One day, Elisha was out plowing his field with 11 other guys, and an old man walks up to him, throws his cloak on him, and then walks away. And that's a weird way to begin your afternoon, and we would all be puzzled, but Elisha knew exactly what was going on. He knew that he had been called, that he had been chosen. Everyone knew who Elijah was. The man who called down fire from heaven and burned up the bowl that had been soaked with water. He was the man who had prayed and stopped the rain for 3 years. He was the guy who just got done finishing slaughtering 450 prophets of Baal. He was the guy who prayed again and the rains came back. He was the guy who challenged the king. He was the man who the king and queen wanted dead. And so Elisha's out there probably taking advantage of the fresh rains and getting the work of farming back started up again. And so he's working the ground, and Elijah shows up. And Elisha understood in that moment that he had been called to the life of the messenger of God. And he also got to make his own decisions of whether or not he would accept the call, because we see him running up to Elijah and asking a few questions. And to me, this shows that after Elijah tossed him the cloak and he walks away, Elisha still has a choice to make. He can join Elijah, or he can go back to farming. Elisha understood that this was a significant occasion in his life. God was entering in and changing everything he knew. And I think that God does this even for today. I think that God likes to enter our lives for just a short moment here and there, maybe weekly, maybe monthly, just to show us, look, I can change everything. Why don't you follow me in this direction? And then he walks away. And it's up to us to decide whether or not we're going to go follow him. We're going to pursue this God who showed up for just a moment to show us who he was. Elisha knew that he was being called to the life of the prophet, and that's the next reason that made him decide to radically change everything for the sake of God and for the sake of the glory of his kingdom. See, Elisha understood that he was being called and that his life would never be the same. When Jesus called each of us to follow him, he planned on changing each of us. Life would never be the same again. And when you made the decision to run after Jesus, it meant that you had to leave behind the former life. Things were going to be different for you from now on. And Jesus still does that today. Even though we have made the decision to follow him, he continues to show up and to lead us further and further from worldly nonsense and to show us the calling he's given each of us. Each new moment with him is a decision. Will I follow Jesus or will I follow the world? He shows up, he points us in a direction, and then he leaves us with a choice. So in the second book, Prince Caspian of the the Chronicles of Narnia series, the children are pulled back into the land of Narnia, and they are told by a dwarf that they have to go and find Prince Caspian. There's a great battle waging, and they need to go find Prince Caspian to help everything out. And so they're on this path through these woods. They think it's a path. They're not sure it is. They're crossing rivers. They're climbing cliffs. They're trying to get to Prince Caspian. And every once in a while, the youngest one, Lucy, she sees a glimpse of Aslan, the great giant, or not great giant, the great lion, the great lion through the trees, or over on a cliff, or looking down at her, and then he turns and walks away. And she tries to tell the others, look, there's Aslan, we need to go that way. And the other children are older and more wise, of course, right? And they say, no, we're going to go this way. We think we need to go this way. Well, things end up going south for them, and they eventually end up where they need to go. And Aslan appears before all of them. And as we know, Aslan is a picture of God in the world of Narnia. He's the one who created all of that. But Aslan comes before the children and says, why didn't you believe Lucy? And then he turns to Lucy and says, why didn't you follow me? You see, he was giving her just glimpses of himself so that she would follow him. He didn't show up to all of them and say, all right, everybody, here's the plan. You're going to follow me. I'm in charge. Let's go fight the enemy. He showed up for just a moment and then walked away and said, will you follow this path that I'm taking you on? Will you trust me enough to come after me? The Lion of Judah stands before us today. We try to look for signs, but I can't help but wonder if instead of giving us blaring signs, if he just gives us little glimpses of himself. We have to make the choice to follow. Are you choosing the path for your life? Do you continually look like somebody whose life is radically different than before? Elisha was given the choice, and he left behind the familiar to pursue the radical. Jesus came to change our hearts so completely that we shouldn't be able to hide the change that's been wrought in our hearts. Life as before can't continue. Life is different now. So here's my question. How does your life look? Is it radically different from your friends and neighbors who don't know Jesus? Or which areas have you been radically changed? In which areas are you still the same? If you're going to follow Jesus, there's going to be a change. And the discouragement is sometimes we notice this big blaring thing and we forget to see that God has changed us here and here and here and here. And we're getting to this, so don't worry. But sometimes we focus on this thing and why hasn't this been changed and why am I the same here, that we take for granted that God has changed us here and here and here and here. I want to encourage you. First of all, how has he changed you? Because he has. And second, there's going to be a time to deal with this big one. And when that comes, let's be faithful to do so. Because he's called us to a higher and better life. One that looks radically different. Let's keep talking about Elisha. Elisha, not only did he understand that he was being called, but he also understood what the call meant. He knew that everything was going to be different from now on, and so he runs up to Elijah and he says, you know what, I need to go say goodbye to my parents. He knows that once he decides to go down this path of listening to God, to God's call in his life, the old life has nothing for him now. He knows that he has to make a significant break with the old life, and symbolizes that by saying goodbye to his parents. Do you show people what it means to follow Christ? Do we understand what it means to be called by Christ? You know, we can't follow the new path of Christ if we have our eyes on the old path. Our son Eli has been riding his bike without training wheels for a while now, and one of the first lessons was to keep your eyes on where you want to go. Because what would happen is he'd be riding really good, and then I would say something, or Michelle would say something, we'd be on a walk together, and he would turn around to see, what are we doing back there? And dun-dun-dun-dun. You got to keep your eyes on where you want to go. Following Jesus means we have to say goodbye to the world and keep our eyes on him. I've had a couple different missionaries tell me that there's a major problem when it comes to trying to lead Hindus to know who Christ is. They just want to add Jesus to the list of gods that they serve. There's over 300 million gods in Hinduism, and the people live in constant fear of them. They try to make sure they're serving the right ones, because if they follow the wrong ones, then maybe these gods will come and hurt their family or cause them to be sick or their cows to die or something. So Christians show up and tell them how great Jesus is and how he died for them and he saved them and he forgives their sins, and the Hindus are excited, and so they put a picture of Jesus right next to all their other gods. And they add him to the list. Because he's a good guy. Don't get me wrong. He saved me. All right. He forgives my sins. Great. He wants to rescue me from hell. That's perfect. I'll serve him. I'll put him next to Ganesh and all the other ones. They don't understand that serving Jesus means saying goodbye to all the other ones. And this is the message that we carry with us. When we choose to follow Jesus, we have to say goodbye to everything else. There's no turning back. We don't submit these or follow these things to Jesus, or follow these things and Jesus, I should say. Now, at best, we submit these dreams and careers and hobbies, etc., to the lordship of Jesus. We put them under him and say, Lord, help me to use these for your kingdom. But most of the time, we have to say goodbye. Jesus tells us in Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. No one can serve both God and money. Saying yes to Jesus means saying goodbye to everything else. And saying yes to anything else means saying goodbye to Jesus. Elisha understood his calling, and so he said goodbye to everything else in his life, and he chose to follow God. So let me ask you this. What in your life is causing you to say goodbye to Jesus? What is causing you to take your eyes off of the path that Jesus has laid out for you so that you end up crashing? You can crash into sin. You can crash into old habits. You can crash into things that really don't distinguish you from your non-Christian acquaintances. Is Jesus worth it to you? Is he worth saying goodbye to everything else? Elisha understood, I have to say goodbye to everything else and choose to follow God. He understood the calling and what it meant. Are you willing to say goodbye to everything else? And is there anything that you're putting on the shelf, maybe not next to Jesus, maybe a little bit under, but it's something that you need to say goodbye to? See, Elisha, he was called, and he understood that he was being called, and he understood what the call meant, and he understood how serious the call was. Let's jump back in here into chapter 19, verse 21. If you put your Bible down or your phone down or your iPad, or if you wrote it out on a scroll, jump back to verse 19 with me. Not 19, 21. Verse 21 with me. So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and become his attendant. Life was different now that he had accepted the call. He said goodbye to his parents, but then he took it one step further. He burned and cooked his livelihood. There's no going back. Once Elisha made the decision to follow God, the call of God in his life, he made it so that he couldn't return to the past. It was a complete surrender to God. He did this for two reasons. Number one, he knew that he was never coming back. He planned on following God to the end, and there wasn't a reason to come back, so he got rid of the past completely. That's the mountaintop experience, right? This is what you go through when you're at church camp. Oh, I'm following God forever. I'm never turning back. And, I'm going to love him for all of my life. And then Elisha, step two, I think that he wanted to remove any shred of temptation that would ever lure him away from the call of God in his life. If you destroy the very subject of the temptation, you can't go back to that. There's a song by the band For King and Country that talks about leaving the past behind. The song refers to leaving behind sin and the former life, and it starts new with God. I want to read the lyrics to you. The lyrics read, "Burn the ships, cut the ties. Send a flare into the night, say a prayer, turn the tide, dry your eyes, and wave goodbye." And then it says, if I can find it, "So light a match, leave the past, burn the ships, and don't you look back." You've probably heard about burning bridges in relationships and how you can't redeem that if you've done that. The idea with this song is that when we sail to a new destination with God, we burn the ship when we get there so we can't return. There's no option but to move forward. Can't help but wonder if this song was inspired by the 1519 conquistador Hernan Cortez. When he reached Mexico, he had two main objectives. The first one was military conquest of all of Mexico. I'm going to go, I'm going to probably find the city of gold, whatever it be, conquest, conquer all of them, conquer the land, claim it for Spain. And the second goal was, and we're going to convert everybody to Catholicism. We're going to make everybody here know who God is. Now, to make their mission clear, when they landed at Mexico, Cortez sunk his own ships. He sunk them so that the men knew and so that he knew, from here on out, we go forward. We're not going to give up here in a week and get on the ship and go back to Spain where things are comfortable. No, we complete the mission. This is why we're here. There's no going back. He got rid of even, you can't even think, I wish I could go back to Spain now because the ship is gone. He got rid of the temptation, rid of any means of the temptation even taking place. You see, Elisha burned the yoke and had a barbecue with the oxen. So, he had the call of God in his life. And there was no returning to the former ways. Since most of you have been following Jesus for a while now, I hope that you understand that there's no going back, and you probably do. But now that you've seen light and life and hope and peace, why turn back to the darkness? What does it hold? What does your former life have that can compare to even the smallest of the blessings of the Lord? You understand that there's no going back, and I hope that at least in your mind you've removed the past and making it like it's never existed, that going backwards is no longer an option. We move forward now, only towards King Jesus. And yet, the devil shows up, and he likes to tempt us with the former things. Wouldn't it be nice to go back to that? Wouldn't it be nice to return to that lifestyle or that attitude or that habit or even that hobby? Not things even that could be necessarily bad or evil. Just things that distract away. Things that take our eyes off of Jesus and maybe make us crash every once in a while. And yes, some sinful things too. A preemptive strike in following God could be that we ask God to remove the desire in us, to return to the former, to return to the appeal of the former way of life. Elisha burned the yokes and he slaughtered the oxen. I hope that you can allow God to be that complete in your life when it comes to turning away from the nonsense of the world. If you're going to live out the calling that God has given you, then you can't go back. If this is a temptation for you, it would be nearly for all of us, I would have to say. I would encourage you to ask God to remove that desire, to block that temptation. And why? So that you can fully live out the calling that God has placed on your life. When Elisha made the decision to follow God, he understood there's no going back. He pretty much removed his past. The plan for each of us is to never return to the former way of life, so that we have to ask the Lord to help us remove it. For each of us, the process looks a little bit different, and for some of us it's more intense than others. But the calling, the goal is the same, to resolutely follow Jesus. We understand that from the beginning, we say goodbye. We never turn back. We never go back. I encourage you to ask God to build this kind of resolution into your life, to fully understand the seriousness of your calling that He's put in your life. You might even have to start out by saying, God, I don't know. I don't know. That sounds pretty intense. Help me to want to do what is right. Help me to want to choose to not go back. You know, Elisha wasn't content with just telling God, okay, God, I'll follow you now. He demonstrated it in how he chose to be different. God did a work in his heart, so he chose to leave behind the old ways. Elisha couldn't keep the old ways and just add God into the mix. It was one way or the other, and Elisha chose to follow God and say goodbye to the old way of life. Elisha didn't want to leave the opportunity open to return, so he burned the ships. He made it so that if the temptation ever rose to go back, there was nothing for him to return to. He got rid of the temptation. He chose to get rid of it. This is us in our walk with God. Even if you've been following Him for longer than I've been alive, if we say that Jesus lives in us, then we need to choose to be different. We need to choose to say goodbye to the former ways that we used to live in. We need to choose to radically remove the temptation to burn the bridges, the way back to how we used to live. God has called each of us, not just to follow Him, but for specific tasks and purposes. And we'll get to talk about all those in the coming weeks. We'll get to see God's glory poured out over Elisha. I'm really excited looking at some of these stories and seeing what it means for us, and just looking at how God did amazing things through just a normal ox plowing guy. But for us, for right now, we have the choice. And yes, many, if not all of you, have chosen to ask God to forgive you, and your desire is to follow Him. But how do we take it a step further? Maybe better, is there anything holding you back? In the words of Paul, he says, forgetting what is behind and straining towards what is ahead, I press on towards the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. It's a strain, it's a struggle we have to push through, but we see the prize, and that's why we continue to go. I want to encourage you as we go. The Lord has lots of neat things, and He's excited to see what all He wants to do in all of us. So let's continue to remember Him and just His goodness and truth poured out upon us today. So let's go before the Lord in prayer. I'll give you a moment. If you want to turn your cameras on, you're more than welcome to wave to each other. Again, like I said, what we're doing here on the screen will not be on the YouTube. I have a separate camera that will be for YouTube so that it can be a little bit more clear. So let's go before the Lord in prayer, and then we'll get a chance to wave to each other. So Jesus, thank you. Thank you for pouring out your grace upon us. Help us, Lord, to make the hard decisions of following you. And Lord, everyone here that I can see, we know you, we love you, we want to follow you, we want the best of your life and our life. We want to show that to others. But there's still things, Lord, that tempt us to go back. And I ask that you would help us as we struggle with those. I ask, Lord, that you would help us to see just the importance and seriousness of following you. God, we're amazed at your truth and your grace poured out on us. Help us, Lord. Help us to choose every day to follow you. Thank you for your servant Elisha, and ask, Lord, that through your word that he would be an encouragement to us over the coming weeks. We ask, Lord, for special blessings for each of our members who are here today on the screen or who get to watch it later in the week. Ask for blessings over each of them, that you would encourage, that you would bless and strengthen. And ask, Lord, that you would just keep us safe, both from sickness and from any of the storms that are coming. Thanks, God, for all you do. Amen.